Good evening, everybody. I think they did give my name. I am Don Gordon, the Executive Director of the Riley Institute, and it's an absolute pleasure to see all of you here. This is our 12th annual StraightTalk series presentation, presented obviously as a collaboration between the Riley Institute and Ollie at Furman, and this year with a great deal of help from our colleagues and friends in the Shy Institute for Sustainable Communities. I hope that you were all able to sample the food that was out there. I hope you did. It was good. And our goal was basically to offer tasty foods and illustrate the benefits of the climate of a plant-based diet. Obviously, we don't expect you all to be vegan, but if 38% of all Americans moved to meatless Mondays, it would be the equivalent of taking 1.6 million cars off the road for an entire year. That is huge. Last week, we heard about the causes of impact of climate change and solutions to the crisis that we face from Dr. Angel Sue and from former Vice President Al Gore. And by the way, his 2-minute and 37-second ovation was the longest I've ever heard at Furman since I've been here, which is a long time. Tonight, we turn our attention to industry. What are corporations doing? What should they be doing? And really, why does it matter? As you listen to our keynote speaker and our discussants, we invite you to submit questions. Please note the QR code in your program and up on the screen. You may use your phone to submit a question, and during the last few minutes of the program, a Furman student will select some of your questions to ask the discussants. We begin tonight with a presentation by Phyllis Cuttino, the CEO and president of the Climate Reality Project and a 1988 graduate of Furman University. Phyllis was a political science major, and I taught her, and I taught Tom Davis, the state senator who will be joining on the stage as a discussant. I will tell you that I don't know what they learned from me, but I guarantee you I have learned a massive amount from both of them over time. Political science is the kind of major that can prepare you for a lot of things, just as almost any major is at Furman. Phyllis took her Furman degree and has used it as a springboard for a storied career. She comes here tonight as someone who has developed expertise in clean energy, clean air, and climate policy, someone who has led collaborative advocacy efforts across the country. When she was at Pew Charitable Trust, Phyllis led all sustainability efforts, including clean energy and flood-prepared communities programs, the Pew Project on National Security, Energy and Climate, the Clean Energy Business Network, and the Pew Campaign for Fuel Efficiency. As the executive director of the Climate Action Campaign, Phyllis led a coalition of 14 of the country's leading climate and health organizations, representing over 12 million Americans, to build momentum for federal climate, clean air, and clean energy policy. In her current role as president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project, she leads collaborative efforts across the globe. She has offices in DC and in 10 branch offices around the world, along with 45,000 climate leader activists in over 100 countries. She leads this climate crisis action to promote also a just, equitable, and clean future. Please join me in welcoming Phyllis Cuttino to the stage.
Thanks, Dr. Gordon. It's great to be here, and it's amazing to think that Dr. Gordon was my professor more than 30 years ago. He hasn't aged a day. I don't know what's going on here at Furman, but I've got to bottle up some and take it home because I want to look as good as he does. And I want to thank all of you for coming, of course, and to Jules Fusen, who organized the StraightTalk series, the 12th. That's quite amazing, long and storied record. But I'm looking forward to this evening. This is, I think, just the third time since COVID that I have been in an audience of people. So usually I do this over video, so it's exciting to be back in person and see all of your faces. And of course, as a former student, it's wonderful to be back on this beautiful, vibrant, truly special campus and in the company of other Purple Paladins. I and my husband, who's also a Furman alum, we don't get back to Furman or Greenville very much, but we love, when we do, every time we're here, we're stunned by the improvements and just how lovely the campus is, although I do miss those trees around the mall. You notice that right away when you drive in. And I spent as a student many hours in this very auditorium in McAllister, attending events just like this one and earning my CLPs. And I can tell you that more than 30 years ago when I was a student here, in my wildest dreams, I never would have expected that I would return as a CLP. So anyway, it's quite remarkable. And for those of you students who are here and are earning a CLP tonight, man, I hope you're keeping up with those and not like me, where you get to the end of the semester and you're like, wow, I gotta go to 4 of them and there's only 4 left. So anyway, but I'm also honored to be here at the invitation of the Riley Institute Center for Critical Issues. I have long been an admirer of Governor Riley, as I'm sure all of you have been as well. Early in my professional life, I watched the governor and then Secretary Riley very, very effectively champion education and its importance in an increasingly competitive world. And of course, in the time since I graduated from Furman, our world has become both more competitive and more complicated, economically, geopolitically, and of course, environmentally. I would argue, in fact, that the issue that we're all here to discuss today, the climate crisis, is rapidly accelerating both complexity and challenge across the public and private sectors. Now, last week, I know, as part of this series, you heard from Dr. Sue, and my boss, Vice President Al Gore, about the impacts and evidence of climate change that's happening all around us every day. Heat waves and droughts, storm intensity and flooding, wildfires and water scarcity, sea level rise and coastal inundation. Sadly, Charleston, one of my favorite cities and home to my ancestors, is 4th on the list of the top 25 US cities most vulnerable to and endangered by climate change. And the list of impacts goes on, and it's critical to remember that we are still in the initial stages of this crisis. Major greenhouse gases linger in the atmosphere for tens to hundreds of years. So today's emissions, what we put in the air today, are tomorrow's climate impacts. And we know that those that are the least responsible for the crisis are among those that will be the most impacted. Now, the Vice President, my boss, has been telling us, and world leaders and corporate boards and policymakers for more than 20 years that our collective future depends upon how we approach and respond to the crisis. With the scale and the pace of climate change today already straining the health of countless species, the oceans, freshwater resources, physical infrastructure, and societies everywhere, we must rapidly decarbonize. Or these impacts are going to become even less manageable than they already are today. And so that's why the push is on to rapidly reduce emissions and limit further climate change to less than 2 degrees, or hopefully 1.5 degrees, the goal that was set under the international agreements reached in Paris in 2015. As individuals and as communities, like Greenville or Furman, we have a responsibility to contribute to the solution. However, I have long believed, given my work in the past, that the private sector can and must play a special role in addressing the climate crisis. It's not only the case because just 100 companies, most of them fossil fuel companies, are responsible for more than 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also the case because business can operate at the scale and at the speed we need to decarbonize in the coming years. My own work with business and public policy has demonstrated this truth. So let me give you just a couple of examples. So 20 years ago, a long time, I ran an advocacy campaign to require an increase in fuel economy, or miles per gallon, for cars and light trucks. And in 2007, after a long and hard-won lobbying effort and advocacy effort in Congress, Congress passed and President Bush signed into law the Energy Independence and Security Act, which included a fleet-wide standard requiring that cars and trucks get to 35 miles per gallon by 2020. Now again, fleet-wide, not every vehicle, but across the fleet, 35 miles by 2020. At the time, this was a remarkable increase of 40% above what had been the current level, which had been unchanged for 25 years. Now, industry mounted a strenuous opposition. They claimed, among other things, that it wasn't technologically feasible, that it couldn't be done, that consumers didn't value fuel efficiency. But eventually, industry got on board with the new program and was close to achieving the goal of 35 mpg, not by 2020, but by 2014, 6 years ahead of schedule. And now today, every major auto manufacturer is not only betting big on fuel efficiency, but also on electric vehicles. And in fact, some of them are either manufacturing here in South Carolina or plan to in the future. Consumer demand for EVs is off the charts. And now some states and cities are beginning to ban gas-powered vehicles. For instance, recently in California, just in the last couple of weeks, California banned gas-powered vehicles, new sales of gas-powered vehicles in 2035. Now, California, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. It's the 10th largest global car market. So it is going to have an unbelievable impact. And other states are going to follow California and their policy. So it is going to be a remarkable transformation in our transportation sector. So then my other example is 15 years ago, I directed, as Dr. Gordon said, all the clean energy efforts for the nonpartisan Pew Charitable Trusts and created their Clean Energy Business Network, which included clean energy companies in every state in the nation. We worked to speed the deployment of renewable energy sources throughout the power sector. States started passing renewable energy portfolio standards, that is, requiring that a percentage of electricity be generated from renewables. And the federal government offered tax incentives for the deployment of wind, of solar, of geothermal, of fuel cells, a variety of renewable technologies. So in that case, the critics said, renewables would be a minor player in the power sector. They never amount to much. They were too expensive, they were too intermittent, too challenging, too hard to integrate into a complicated, centralized grid. And so what's happened? In recent years, renewable energy has accounted for 50 to 75% of all new additions to the American electric generating capacity, as utilities have realized the economic and environmental advantages of deploying clean energy. And local solar, rooftop and community solar, are also growing exponentially, and now the offshore wind sector is ready to boom. The Inflation Reduction Act, with $370 billion in support for clean energy, climate, and environmental justice, was just passed a couple of weeks ago and signed into law. And these investments and incentives are going to turbocharge clean energy deployment and manufacturing even more. So according to the American Clean Power Association, that's an industry group that represents utilities like Southern and others, microgrid, storage, wind, and solar energy companies. This is what they've said about that bit of policy. The IRA will be a starting gun for a period of regulatory certainty and generate over $900 billion in economic activity through the construction of new clean energy projects. Of course, it's also going to work to save consumers money, to put millions of Americans to work, enhance our energy security, and reduce emissions. So now, these are just two examples from the transportation and the utility sectors, and there are many others, but I offer these to you as proof that when industry gets moving in the right direction, it can make remarkable progress, not only for themselves, but for the country. Will there be challenges? Of course, yes. But I have faith in the ingenuity and the innovation of industry to overcome these challenges. And in reality, oftentimes, the sector is often looked to when government fails to act. We look to industry to see what can be done. So these couple of examples go away towards addressing the question that Jill asked me to touch on today, which is, can and will businesses do the right thing in the face of the climate crisis? For myself, I know they can, and I believe they will in the months and the years ahead, because doing so is so clearly in their best interest. So why? Why is it in their best interest? Well, first, if businesses don't address the climate crisis, they face increasing risks themselves, right? Physical risks to their assets and their investments, reputational risks, supply chain difficulties associated with shipping and storms and other climate impacts, and risks of having climate and emissions regulations imposed upon them by government. So that's one. Second, consumers' purchasing decisions are increasingly factoring the sustainability of products and the services they buy. Two of the largest generational groups, Gen Z and millennials, represent a massive cohort of current and future consumers that care deeply about the climate and sustainability. So corporations that understand that will be rewarded in the marketplace, and laggards risk being left behind. So third, key stakeholders, shareholders, employees, communities, and yes, importantly, regulators like the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission are requiring increasing visibility and reporting into how and if a business factors climate change and related risks into how they will address them into their strategy and decision making. Shareholders are mounting campaigns. Credit rating agencies like Moody's are evaluating businesses' approach to the crisis. Employees are pushing companies to act or deciding to go work for companies that will. So fourth, businesses thrive on predictability. We've designed our economies around certain climate conditions and expectations. Climate patterns like the one I described earlier, floods and droughts and wildfires, introduce massive unpredictability into the economy. And simply put, climate stability is good for business in a way that climate instability is bad for business. So fifth and finally, decarbonization is good for the bottom line because it typically involves reducing waste and gaining efficiencies. The costs associated with climate change are likely to be significant for businesses and, frankly, for all of us if we don't act. But the opportunities that come from addressing it are significantly higher. And so we have a big job to do in getting every corner of the private sector to understand these truths and to act on them. And this is what we call raising the climate IQ. And events like this are important for that very reason, because they help people of all kinds, business leaders, professors, retirees, students, understand the risks and opportunities associated with climate change. And that's what my organization, the Climate Reality Project, is all about. We help humanity raise its climate IQ. We train leaders in climate science and solutions and work with key sectors and industries to understand what's happening and help them to both act and advocate intelligently. We do that here in the United States, and we do it around the world. And we believe that the business sector can and will do the right thing, particularly when their climate IQ is high. And they understand that climate action is in their own self-interest. And business leaders, they're no different from anyone else and often embody a principle that I learned a lot about here at Furman, which is do well while doing right. Right? Many business leaders understand that solving the climate crisis is not an imposition, but it's an opportunity to innovate, like those car companies, an opportunity to adapt and lead, an opportunity to produce the products that consumers and countries all around the world want, and an opportunity to leave our children, in my case, 2 Gen Zers, and our grandchildren a better world. So already, 370 global companies have committed to go 100% renewable. That's remarkable, 370. And sure, there are challenges to reimagining much of our economy, but these can be overcome, as I said. Thankfully, there are plenty of examples of companies that are demonstrating that they can do well while doing right. And so I'll give you just a few examples. I'm sure that all of us have a Patagonia backpack or a piece of clothing, a coat maybe, or other gear. It's a well-known company to all of us. They have long been considered a leader in corporate sustainability, but in 2021, they announced they would be upping the intensity of their carbon reduction efforts by addressing supply chain emissions and striving to achieve their carbon neutrality goal without the help of carbon offsite pricing and purchasing. Wow. And that's not all. Patagonia has also encouraged customers of theirs to reduce their consumption practices and offers a repair program for their products to extend their longevity. Another example is Ikea. Ikea has implemented a strategy that addresses concerns from pre to post-production of their products that will now only be using renewable and recycled materials, and they too will extend their life cycle of their products so that customers can refurbish and reuse them more readily. So this is an important differentiate from other corporations who focus only on post-production recycling. They are doing it from pre-production through post-production. And Ikea also has a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across their supply chain by 2030 to match the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And then, of course, we all have light bulbs. Philips Lighting has implemented a more sustainable lifestyle business model. They take lighting equipment for repurposing when the customer is finished with it, and they also have a goal to source 75% of their total energy consumption from renewable energy sources by 2025, so 3 years from now. And they have a commitment to partnering with suppliers who contribute to supply chain emissions reduction efforts. So those are just a few examples of some businesses that are working to create new revenue streams in an effort to become more sustainable. And they're encouraging their suppliers, their partners, and their customers to take action with them. So those are national and international examples of leadership, but we're going to hear tonight from other leaders who are closer to home. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and hearing from Milliken Company. Now that's a company that's been in this area since it's got its start in 1864. And they've been reinventing and adapting for the last 150 plus years. And we're also going to hear from a new market entrant, Proterra Transit. That's a company founded in 2004 that's helping to fuel the transition of the transportation sector to electric. So I hope everybody had an opportunity to look at the electric bus on your way in and get on and see how fantastic that is. But these are brand new, it's a brand new product. And then besides companies, of course, there are organizations and associations that are helping businesses understand and make these transitions, like Sustain South Carolina. And of course, we need policymakers like Senator Tom Davis, who's also going to be on the stage tonight, who's working at these policymakers at the local, at the state, and at the national level to pass policies that encourage and yes, sometimes require companies to act. So these companies, organizations, and policymakers, they're all demonstrating the importance and the need to raise our climate IQ, to set sustainability goals and to act, because we won't get there if we don't begin and we don't set goals that we are aiming for. So let me end really where I began. The issue of climate change is the greatest economic, social, political, and environmental challenge facing humanity. It's also an enormous opportunity for the future. And I'm optimistic that we can work together across sectors and societies to make a difference, because the world depends on it. So I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight. I'm looking forward to working with all of you in these efforts. I hope that you'll go to our website and think about joining Climate Reality Project in a training, or join a chapter, or help us in our advocacy efforts, because we need you. We need everybody to get involved in addressing the climate crisis. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis. When we talk about everything it takes to actually decarbonize and win the day on climate, it's very helpful to hear tangible examples of what we mean. So it's really great. This also resonates a lot with some of what we heard last week. The need to work across scale and across sector. So we heard examples of businesses big and small, and we heard examples of policy state to national. And last week we spent a long time collaboration across sectors, collaboration scale across scale, local to national and beyond. And so hopefully we can continue that dialogue. For those of you who were not here last week and don't remember me, my name is Matt Cohen, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Sustainability Sciences here at Furman. And I am pleased to moderate our panel tonight and learn from the speakers along with you. Unfortunately, our next speaker, Katie Thomas, had a family emergency and is not available to join us tonight. So I hope you all join me in wishing the best for Katie and her family. And no students, that does not necessarily mean we're going to leave early. I do have a few takeaway messages from Katie's talk that I think are helpful to share, just to help us frame the dialogue that we're about to have on the stage. Katie is a lead for the Kearney Consumer Institute. And she's been conducting research on consumer perspectives on sustainability and climate. And one takeaway that we want to consider is that, as Phyllis noted, consumers, particularly younger consumers, are really driven and motivated by sustainable product offerings. But at the same time, we see a world where consumers are bombarded with information. I don't know how many of you ever reflect on the amount of information you process in a given day. It's really overwhelming. I often liken this to the nutrition facts on the side of a cereal box or anything else you might buy at the grocery store. And so being an informed activist consumer is a lot of pressure. And it takes a whole lot to be on top of all of this. So consumers are interested, but they're bombarded with information, and it's really hard for someone making a consumer decision to necessarily be the activist that drives the corporation to then provide the sustainable offering. But consumers do have that power. We're going to learn more tonight that these corporations are genuinely responsive to consumer interest and consumer demand. But it creates a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where the consumer needs to make the demand, but the corporation needs to make the signal to the consumer to kind of weed through the information, which kind of leads us to this final point, which is that corporations also have the opportunity to drive consumers. We often think that corporations will provide the supply that meets consumer demand, but oftentimes supply can drive demand as well. And so when we have consumers that just want the options, right? They know they want something more sustainable. They know they want a lighter carbon impact. it's possible for corporations to predetermine some of those options and constrain our decisions by offering fewer, more sustainable products. And so the kind of the takeaway message then is, how do we create this virtuous feedback between consumers thirsty for change, corporations wanting to meet consumers, and kind of finding that cycle where the informed consumer is able to acquire the product they want, which is also motivated by the corporations that want to draw them in. So it's a big headache, but as our first speaker has eloquently shared with us, it's happening. And we want to learn tonight how we drive this even faster as we confront a crisis that's pending, if it's not already here. So I'm going to go ahead and invite our panelists to the stage. And while they come up to join us, I want to remind you all, as you hear us discuss, there is a QR code on your brochure on the program and also on the screen. So if you have questions as the evening progresses, please log your questions. And we have a team backstage led by Laura Bain, who is Associate Director of Sustainability Assessment at Furman. She works with the Shy Institute of Sustainable Communities. She and a team of excellent students are going to be cataloging the questions, organizing them, and preparing them. So in real time, as they receive the questions, they are processing them backstage, and they will pose them to the panel at the end. So this is your chance to participate in the program. And I look forward to seeing what questions you have at our conclusion. All right, so let's see. We're joined by a distinguished panel this week. We have with us Ethel Bunch, who is the CEO of Sustain SC. Sustain SC is a nationally recognized organization that brings together South Carolina stakeholders at the intersection of commerce and conservation. Next, we have Julian Soell, the CEO of Proterra Transit. Proterra is a local business that manufactures electric buses and whose parent company is revolutionizing how we think about powering commercial vehicles. Next, we have Kasel Knight, Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Head of Sustainability for Milliken Company. Milliken's a global manufacturing leader that works across the textile, chemical, floor covering, and healthcare businesses. Next, we have Senator Tom Davis, a Republican representing Beaufort and Jasper Counties, who introduced and shepherded through the South Carolina Energy Freedom Act of 2019. And finally, we all know Phyllis Cuttino, who just did a terrific job setting the stage for our conversation. So let's welcome our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. All right, so we'll start with you, Ethel, since you're sitting closest to me. Given the scale of our economy, corporations are obvious stakeholders, as we've learned in the drive to meet our climate goals. So Ethel, from your position with Sustain SC, what have you observed among South Carolina industries?
Sure. So I'm happy to be here with you all, excited about this conversation. So Sustain SC's mission is to connect the sustainability goals of business in South Carolina with local solutions. And the way that we really look at South Carolina is we're 21 million acres, so that's a finite number. 5 billion in population, that took us about 290 years to get here, and we're going to more than double that population in the next 60 years. So I think our Southern charm has attracted some new folks to come see us. But our economy is led by forestry, agriculture, and tourism, all of which rely heavily on our natural resource-based infrastructure and our quality of life. So we need to pay attention to those they're invaluable things. We're also bookended by Michelin up here in the upstate, and in the low country is Boeing, and in between there are 1,200 global companies. And each of those global companies, as Phyllis was talking about, have set very ambitious sustainability goals. They are going to be net zero, water positive, zero waste. They're committed to environmental justice. And so Sustain SC is committed to making sure that those global goals can really be applied at that local level. So we work with the companies to see what are those opportunities, what are those challenges, to really get those commitments here in South Carolina, not only to drive economic innovation, new jobs, new investments, but also to help them reduce their footprint in South Carolina. We know that the next billion-dollar industries are not really necessarily going to be the search engines or the media companies, but they're going to be clean energy, they're going to be green cement, they're going to be green steel, green technologies. And so how do we really assess the demand of the companies in South Carolina and try to attract that supply to drive our economy? And it's been said a lot that we're really in the stage of this next decade. We're transitioning from that industrial revolution to the sustainable revolution. And we believe that South Carolina has every opportunity with the makeup that I just described to really lead in that area. And if I can just give a few examples of what that looks like. So right here we have Proterra next to me, and everybody knows Michael Porter and that we really set out the cluster model. And so South Carolina is known for that automotive cluster. And what we're seeing now is the transition from the combustion engine to the EV. So now South Carolina can be known for the EV cluster. Proterra, Oshkosh, Arrival, Mercedes, BMW, Volvo. And so as we see that, that's new economic innovation, that's new jobs, that's new investments. But everybody here needs to drive an EV. And every student needs to be in a Proterra bus, and our public transportation needs to be transitioning into all Proterra buses to be reducing our footprints here. But again, opportunity. Bosch just made their announcement last week. It was a $200 million, 350 jobs for the new hydrogen fuel cell that's going to go into the semi-trucks. So already you're seeing it happen just because of the makeup of our state. Train Technologies with Thermo King has just developed the e-refrigeration technology. That's going to transition into the new e-Sprinter van that's going to be manufactured in 2023 in Charleston. Well, guess what? Thermo King just announced an expansion project. So we can benefit from all of these things happening. But we also have circularity and zero waste to landfill. We have Glassworks. They can't get their hands on enough glass in South Carolina. They're taking it down to a powder state and building a seawall in Beaufort. We have Fiber Industries. They can't get their hands on enough textiles. They were a textile industry that has partnered with the technology to take all of our old clothes, which are the biggest thing filling up our landfills, and they're going to make it into a new textile, taking the dye out, taking it to a new state. Again, a booming circularity economy happening in the state. And then the last thing I will add is as these new technologies are coming, as we assess the demand and we bring in and kind of think about economic development for attracting this new sustainable revolution, this new supply, we also can talk about once a company has assessed and reduced their footprint here, how can they offset their footprint here? So we have green gas that is going and working with our farmers. They're capturing methane. The farmers doing nothing different, but they're getting a new income stream. And now they can keep the farm as farms. They can reduce their own emissions by doing nothing different. And Mercedes just bought up green gas, and I know there are 3 or 4 announcements and other people that are looking at this green gas to start to use. They're turning it into renewable natural gas. There's already an injection point. We have Green Trees that are doing afforestation projects, helping us with flood mitigation. And again, paying those landowners to afforest, reforest lands that should not have been stripped of trees, and they're getting the gold standard of carbon credits that our companies are buying right here in the state. So I could go on and on, but that really is the balance of what we're talking about, doing good by doing well or doing great and driving our economy that we're set up to really benefit and capitalize from, but also working with our companies. I will give one more example. We're working with Google, who's made a water positive commitment. We're working with them on wetland restoration, fire burns. They just gave $500,000 to a land and conservation fund, pure voluntary conservation dollars to protect the water resource which they are using. So how can we also conserve all of our precious natural resources, our highest priority conservation parcels? And our companies are coming to this stage right here in South Carolina and saying, we're here to commit, we're going to take those global goals to the local level. So with that, I think I'll stop for a second.
There's a lot going on in South Carolina.
It's an exciting time.
Yeah, and if a company needs used textiles, we should just invite them up on move-out day.
I think that'd be a great,
Yeah.
great day, yes.
So we have Ethel here representing a cross-industry perspective, and then we also have Kasel and Julian representing specific industries. And so we'll spend a little bit of time with you two before we start thinking about the state perspective. So Kasel, why do you see manufacturers and other industries contributing solutions to the climate crisis? And if you ever want to just be Milliken specific for that question, you're welcome.
Sure, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Kasel Knight. Nice to see you all here. So Milliken is 150 plus years, as Phyllis mentioned, old. And so we're a company that's privately owned and very interested in staying around for the next 150 years. So to do that, you have to sustain the enterprise, sustain your stakeholders, and do well in the present, but also plan and leave enough for the future generations to thrive. And so that's a core aspect of our culture, really, at Milliken. So somewhat perhaps why this was able to take root, but Milliken has long had a sustainability program. We had our first recycling policy in 1900, apparently, but we've recently updated it, and in 2019 published our first sustainability report for our 2018 baseline metrics. And we noticed that a lot of other companies were saying a lot about sustainability, but not really holding themselves accountable. One challenge in this area is the lack of national or global standards around what you pledge to do, how you hold yourself accountable, the metrics that you track. And so we started out by looking for a standard, and we reported to the Global Reporting Initiative, which is one of the leading standards. Now, I believe in 2022, our report is in compliance with 4 other reporting standards, and we're trying to hold ourselves accountable to the extent possible, not only to public opinion by publishing this information, but also to these third-party standards. And we do that not because we're just altruistic and we want to do the right thing. Obviously, that's part of what makes it feel good to be doing this, but we do it because we feel that it's imperative for business growth. We think it's an early adopter of these sustainability metrics, especially net zero science-based targets are going to be a competitive differentiator. We think this is all coming, and it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when, and a lot of it's already here. And it's interesting for a company like Milliken because we don't sell directly to consumers. So we're not getting the direct public opinion that a lot of the consumer companies are, but we are hearing it from a lot of our customers who maybe directly or after that link in the chain sell to consumers. And so as a quiet, fly under the radar, traditional textile, 150-year-old South Carolina company, we could have said, oh, this will blow over, this is not something we want to do, I'm sure it's just a phase or it's political. There's a million excuses, but we saw it as, just as Ethel and Phyllis were saying, it's about economic growth, it's about sustaining, it's about thinking about the future and preparing for that, and it's about creating products that our customers, even if today they're not asking for them, we believe they will, and we're seeing them start.
Great, thank you. And I particularly appreciate what you said about meeting science-based targets. It's one thing we can't stress enough is when we say we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050, that's not an exaggeration or an understatement. So it's always good to hear when people commit to the target set by science. And then Julian, something that I find exciting about Proterra is that we have kind of 2 issues in transportation. One is we need to decarbonize the fuel source that our means of transportation use. But the other is that we need fewer cars on the road. just period. And so I always find the idea of electrification of buses as particularly exciting. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about Proterra, what you do, your mission, and what your presence means for Greenville and the state?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me first off, and thank you everyone for taking the time and spending your evening to be here. I appreciate your commitment and your interest in contributing and learning. So first, I hope you had a chance to see the bus outside. I was going to bring some business cards tonight, but I thought it might be more fun to just bring a bus instead. So, and besides, I needed a ride from work, so that worked out better. So I'm Julian Soell. I'm the president of Proterra Transit. Proterra Transit, so Proterra is a company, it's an American company. It's a technology leader, and we've been around for more than 10 years. Our sole focus is to electrify vehicles, and so to come up with zero tailpipe emission vehicles, specifically in the commercial space. So we have electric buses in the transit industry. We also have electric powertrains, batteries, and powertrains that we sell to other OEMs that are looking to electrify their fleets. And it could be school bus companies, medium or light-duty trucks. And so that's our main focus. If I think about the main part of our business where we started, it's the bus business. And the reason we focused on buses is we figured that buses and public transport there was going to be the first area of transport to go 100% electric. And that the logic there was that of all the different areas, the bus, if you think about buses, they're just the prime candidates for electrification, and we thought they would be the first ones to get to 100%. And the reason they're a great candidate for electrification is they go far every day, and so we have battery technology that can get them there. If I think about, too, the start-stop nature of buses, it's very inefficient for diesel engines and others, but for electric vehicles, it's quite efficient. And then the last one is most nights or most routes, every night, the buses come back to the depot, which is a great time to charge them at night. So it's a very cost-effective and a very predictable way to manage a fleet. So for all those reasons, we said we wanted to focus on buses as the first area to scale. If I think about what you had asked, what it means to Greenville and South Carolina. So the buses, we make them here in Greenville, South Carolina. We also have a battery facility. I'll talk about that in a bit. In Greer, we're just in the process of opening that. It's a state-of-the-art facility with lots of new jobs coming as a result. But if I think about the other impact we have on Greenville and South Carolina, so we have electric buses here in Greenville, and we also have them in other areas in South Carolina, places like Charleston, the Clemson campus, Rock Hill, Charleston, a number of other areas. So we're making a difference there. Lastly, I would say that Greenville has really been critical for us in terms of growing a company, getting a good talent base here in Greenville, and I mentioned the future expansions both in the Greenville location, but then also in our Greer facility, ramping up batteries. So we love the climate here. We're happy to be a part of it, and we look forward to continue to grow here.
Great, thank you. And I have one follow-up. Thinking about lessons from last week was the need for collaborating across scale and across sector. It's one thing to be able to have the capacity to build the buses, which it sounds like Greenville is providing. It's another to scale, buses to a city like Greenville. So I'm curious what kind of obstacles your company might face when trying to expand, bus sales and ultimately bus service to a city like Greenville that's this land use dynamic, the size and population.
Yeah, in truth, demand is really not the challenge. We're very fortunate. We have some very forward-looking cities and states and townships and universities that embrace the product and believe it's the right thing to do. So in terms of scaling things, that's coming. All the cities tend to turn over a portion of their fleet every year, so it's a gradual process in that sense. Honestly, our biggest challenge right now is making enough buses to satisfy the need of our customers, and that's where I spend most of my time is more high-quality, clean emission buses to manufacture out of our facility.
That's great. So electric buses are one example of an infrastructure that we need to plug into a decarbonized grid. But in reality, all commitments that we receive from South Carolina industries are going to be dependent upon our utilities following through on their own commitments to decarbonize. And so, for instance, Duke Energy has committed to a carbon neutral grid by 2050. I've not been keeping track on how are we doing on meeting that. But you can imagine if we don't have an electric grid that decarbonizes and then makes every commitment from every entity tied to that grid that much weaker. And so I'm going to turn a question to Senator Davis. I'm curious what ways the state legislature can help us to transition to a carbon-free energy at the utility scale.
Great, and it's great to be here. I'm a Furman graduated, hard to believe, 40 years ago. And I'm assuming this is a CLP, seeing all the younger students out here, right? I mean, I can remember my senior year, I had the exact number of CLPs written down that I had to go to before I could leave.
And it cuts close now. At the very end of the year, there are students waiting in line that are very worried I may not get in.
I was one of those students, and but I really appreciate being here. And this particular topic is right in my wheelhouse and has been really since 2017, when we saw a massive failure in Fairfield County when the VC Summer nuclear reactors joint venture between SCE&G, Santee Cooper pulled the plug after investing almost $10 billion of ratepayer money. And in the aftermath of that failure in Fairfield County, which is just north of Columbia, we really did an autopsy of our state's energy plan and how we go about generating power and getting to the fundamental issues that you all are talking about here. And I'm ashamed to say that until that happened in 2017, I really never thought much about power. I just flipped a switch and it came on. But what I learned was alarming, and I think is illustrative of what went wrong with VC Summer. About 100 years ago, when we were trying to bring electricity to South Carolina, we had a hard time back then attracting capital. South Carolina was not a place that was a logical place for a lot of entrepreneurs to come down and invest their money. And so the way we worked around that and the way we attracted capital to South Carolina to build out our grid and to bring power throughout the state is we essentially divided the state up into 3 territorial regions. And in the upstate now, you've got utility of Duke that essentially has a vertically integrated monopoly. In the Midlands and heading down toward Beaufort, my neck of the woods, you had SCE&G until recently Dominion purchased them. And then in the PD and in the Georgetown area, you had Santee Cooper, a state-owned public utility. And what we essentially did as legislators 100 years ago is we said to these utilities, we're going to give you a monopoly in this area, this geographic area, to provide power. And the rates that people are going to pay you for that power are going to be a direct function of the capital investment you make. So if you invest $100 billion or whatever it is to generate power, you're going to get a 10.5% return on that capital investment, and that's what ratepayers are going to pay. There's a moral hazard associated with that, right? Because if you think about it, if utilities are being paid rates that are commensurate with their capital investment, they're going to be biased toward capital-intensive projects, right? And they're also going to be less wary when projects tend to run over budget or when they tend to cost more because they're spending more money. Sure, they're going back before the Public Service Commission and they're saying we've had these cost overruns. You demonstrate that you've tried your best and the PSC approves it and you're getting a 10.5% return on all that money you're spending, right? So there's really, you're blowing through a number of stop signs, and that's what we saw with SCE&G and Santee Cooper with the VC Summer project. Long before it failed and they officially pulled the plug in July of 2017, and they literally pulled the plug and left $10 billion worth of scrap out there. But they knew, beginning back in 2014 and 2015 and 2016, that they weren't going to complete this project, that it was running over budget, that natural gas prices had plummeted at that point in time, and they could no longer be competitive with those prices. But they continued on with borrowing and requesting hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars more from ratepayers, and those requests were honored. And so one of the lessons learned in the aftermath of the VC summer failure was there are moral hazards associated with giving a utility a vertically integrated monopoly. And by that I mean they generate the power, they transmit and distribute the power. It's vertically integrated. There is a bias toward capital-intensive projects. There is less of an inclination to seek efficiencies. There is less of an inclination to make course corrections when obvious errors are made. And so the public policy response to that back in, well, it's actually 2019 is when I drafted legislation called the Energy Freedom Act. And really, in legislative terms, 2 years is light year. I mean, that's just lightning speed, 2 years. But what we essentially did in the Energy Freedom Act was we said, irrespective of what territory you're dealing in, if you're an independent power producer, an IPP, that can come in and demonstrate to the Public Service Commission that they can generate power for less than the avoided cost of the utility. In other words, they can generate power more cheaply than the utility that has the monopoly, whether it's Duke or Santee Cooper or back then SCNG, that you have the right to enter into a power purchase agreement with the utility and to sell that power, which in turn would go onto the grid and the savings would be passed along to consumers. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because for the first time, we talked a lot about demand here. I mean, you've talked about corporations, you've talked about shareholders, employees. I mean, there's pent-up demand for clean energy. But unless you loosen up supply and unless you make supply responsive to that demand, all the demand that you're talking about is not going to drive the sort of changes that we deserve and that we need. And so by opening up and breaking down some of these territorial barriers and saying to IPPs, mostly solar companies, who could come forward and demonstrate that they could generate power much more cheaply than a gas-fired plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant. And so you saw in the aftermath of the Energy Freedom Act, solar skyrocket in South Carolina because they finally, the utilities had to deal with them in good faith, had to go ahead and have rate hearings and examine whether or not they could generate power more cheaply. And so I think that's an important policy step that we took forward. What we're doing now, another bill that I drafted immediately after that, because in politics, change or something that you've had in place for a long time only happens when there's been a great disruption, when people are paying attention, because most people are living their lives. They don't think about how their power is generated. But when you get $10 billion, a hole in the ground out in Fairfield County, and ratepayers are paying for it, they get angry and want answers. And so in politics, that gives you a window of time to enact some of the reforms on the supply side that I think will allow us to accommodate the demand that your panelists have been so articulately talking about. And so we established back in 2019 something called an Energy Market Reform Committee that I also chair. I chair the Labor, Commerce, and Industry Committee in the Senate, a standing committee, and this falls within that jurisdiction. And I also chair the Energy Market Reform Committee. And we are charged with coming up with wholesale recommendations on changing our state energy plan come January. So this is extraordinarily timely. One thing I will say is this, that we've been really drilling down on, is what can we do to further open up those markets to solar and to other IPPs. And one constant theme is emerging, is that if you want to compare apples to apples, if you want a solar company to compete on price with a coal-generated plant, for instance, you've got to have a fair allocation of cost to that coal generation, because there are externalities in connection with coal generation, polluting the environment, that make it more expensive, quote unquote, or make it more deleterious to the public. But you got to monetize that in some way. You have to monetize that so that when a solar company comes along and makes a demonstration in the Public Service Commission and says we can generate power more cheaply, that the utility that has that dirtier, quote unquote, alternative, we somehow compel them to monetize those costs and incorporate them into what you're comparing. So that's currently one of the things that we're doing right now is figuring out how to level the playing field for cleaner energy participants in the sector, which don't have those externalities, quite frankly. And one last thing I'll touch upon is on the small retail side, the rooftop solar. That's incredibly important in terms of driving supply behavior. And one of the things that we've been working on there are net metering rules, where homes that have solar panels, and these aren't your 1960s, 1970s solar panels, right? They're flush to the roof line. They're attractive looking. We have a lot of covenants from back in the 60s and 70s that don't like solar panels, but so we're fighting that battle. But one of the things that we are trying to establish are some ground rules on if a homeowner generates power through solar panels that are in excess of that homeowner's needs, can they sell the power back to the grid? And at what price can they sell the power back to the grid? And so, as you might imagine, that's a pitched battle, and you've got stakeholders with competing interests. But if we want to really, in addition to what you're talking about, and I couldn't agree more about companies, having to respond to employees, to customers, to shareholders. I mean, people, this is becoming a consideration by them when they make the decisions. But they have to have choices. You can't, if they're in a monopoly jurisdiction or a territory, they don't have any choice but to buy power from whoever has that utility monopoly in that area. So, and that's a larger question about how do we unleash that retail demand and allow them to, like in Texas is the prime example of this, go out there with a menu of energy options and letting them choose their options. So there's a lot of moving parts here. The ultimate goal is to move toward a cleaner, more climate-friendly power generation. There are important things that the General Assembly can do to clear the decks and allow that to happen. And I view my job as being identifying what those obstacles are, articulating them to my colleagues, and then going ahead and implementing these reforms that allow these market forces that you've been talking about to really drive changes.
Great, thank you. That's great. And in terms of thinking about pricing externalities, I hadn't heard that. So if you all imagine when you pay your electric bill monthly, you aren't paying for the cost of increased asthma rates among children. You aren't paying for mercury in water. You're not paying for, future adaptations to climate change. And so the idea that we can find a way to price that is really remarkable. So Phyllis, we've now heard about legislation at the state level. I imagine you have been pretty busy lately processing the Inflation Reduction Act. Thinking kind of at the federal scale. So I'm curious, what are the policy goals for the Climate Reality Project right now moving forward?
Well, I think the thing that we're most focused on moving forward is how to implement the Inflation Reduction Act quickly, thoughtfully, with communities involved. So these funds are going to move either through the tax code to companies or to individuals, and they're also going to move in terms of the grants through states. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in communities, with state houses, with state policy leaders, to make sure that those funds are being targeted where they can be most useful and are going to have the biggest impact. And so I think that's one thing that we're really focused on. I know it sounds very boring, but implementation, effective implementation of policy.
My students give me this trouble all the time. We say I do sustainability science, and we're all about solutions. Mm-hmm. But then the solutions are often kind of boring in the weeds of policy. So I understand about the boring part.
Policy matters.
It does.
Right? Like the senators just talked about how policy matters. Policy matters. It gives a signal to businesses. It unlocks opportunity, and it really sets the rules of the road. And so policy well done is very, very important.
I hope I have students in the room that are taking note. And my understanding in the IRA is that it's mostly incentive-based and the regulatory burden is not quite as heavy. I'm curious, Senator Davis, what opportunities there might be through this new money coming through to help further the decarbonization efforts that you've been citing.
Yeah, and I think what you're going to see, and Duke and Dominion and Santee Cooper, they see the writing on the wall. They see what's happening here. They see on the demand side the desire for cleaner power. They see on the supply side legislators starting to break down their territorial monopolies, expecting them to be responsive to that consumer demand. And so I suspect what you're going to see, and I don't know where the benefits of the IRA, are they going to be through tax credits? Are they going to be through grants? Are they going to be something that utilities petition for as part of their integrated resources plan, whether that's what they do? I suspect our Public Service Commission will be materially involved in deciding how our state's utilities will be allocated those dollars. I suspect, or I know, that there's going to be some requirements or expectations about what they do with that money. I'm sure they have at the federal level. There's some expectations that they have to use the money for certain purposes. But how you go about equitably allocating those IRA incentives, I think depends upon what the status of a utility's current IRP is, how far along with that are they. I think some of the utilities are a little bit more progressive in that regard, so I think that'll play a factor in it. One of the things that I hope doesn't play a factor in it is the legislature. I mean, this ought not be something where 170 elected officials, all try to be experts in regard to how do we go about generating renewable clean energy in South Carolina. It's important for us to know our limitations, which often we don't. But we have a very good, right now, Public Service Commission. We enacted in the wake of what happened in VC summer some substantial Public Service Commission reforms. We made the Office of Regulatory Staff more of a consumer advocate watchdog. I think we do have a good apparatus there, and I think they'll probably take the lead in deciding how to allocate those incentives.
Great.
May I just say
Absolutely,
something to Senator Davis? I just wanted to thank you because I don't know all the details, but I think it was probably thanks to the act that you were successful in passing that allowed, Milliken has over 50 global locations, the majority of which are in South Carolina, and we have 2 very large plants that are co-located in Blacksburg, South Carolina, and we realized that we were burning coal still there as a backup fuel source, and we needed to upgrade our boilers, which produce steam for our operations. So rather than buy a new electric setup, we were able to build a cogeneration facility that runs on natural gas, and it powers the entire site, so both huge manufacturing facilities, and makes all the steam. And we were able to do that working with Duke so that we're really not buying any electricity for that site. Now, it is natural gas, so the next phase would be some sort of renewable energy source, hydrogen, difficulties with solar, but perhaps solar, and we could replicate that at a lot of our sites in South Carolina. But mostly I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And interesting, in terms of public policy, when you push one part of the balloon, the other one pops out. One of the pushbacks we're getting, and a lot of intensive energy users, like Google, for instance, would like the ability to deal one-on-one with a utility or to develop their own power generation. And some of the pushback you get from some of the smaller consumer advocates is you're taking large-scale users off the grid, which leaves a smaller number of individuals on the grid that got to pick up the balance for the conventional power generation. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, and I think it's something we need to encourage, but we need to understand that in public policy, whenever you enact something and there is a benefit conferred, there is usually a corresponding detriment. And what you try to do is maintain those benefits and mitigate the detriments. And I think we can get there.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Like the gas tax.
Like the gas tax.
And so one thing I want to focus on then is it sounds like leadership plays a role in driving these changes that we need. And so for any of the panelists on the stage, this isn't directed at an individual person, but maybe we could all chime in if we feel inspired, is how important is leadership in this next phase of industry, this sustainability revolutions, I believe, Ethel, you called it. What should leaders be doing to build momentum and support for a transition to a low-carbon economy? So I don't know if Phyllis, if you want to maybe kick us off and we can move down the line.
So from my observation, leadership is the critical ingredient. And if a company or a policymaker or even an individual doesn't make a decision, set a goal, they're never going to get there. And so I believe, in terms of the climate crisis, it is the essential ingredient to solving the climate crisis. And, here on this stage, you have all leaders who are all trying to do the right thing, and they've done it by setting goals and knowing that they want to make change and going about doing that change. And, it's not a journey that's over when you reach a goal. Once you do with the climate crisis, you have to set a new goal and try to get to that goal as well. So I'm proud to be on the stage with these leaders because I think they all have exactly what we need to solve the climate crisis.
Thank you. Senator Davis?
I'll say this about leadership, and I agree with that. Acknowledging some political realities. South Carolina is a Republican conservative state. And one of the things that I have found in being successful in drafting the Energy Freedom Act and getting it passed by my colleagues, and then by following that up with the Energy Market Reform Committee, talk about it in terms that make them comfortable, okay? So what could be more Republican than talking about free markets by not paying rates that are commensurate with giving a monopoly a return on invested capital, but paying rates that are commensurate with what competition on a competitive wholesale market would be. Also a free market principle, externalities. It makes sense to make sure if it's dirty energy, they ought to have those costs built in. On the demand side, I mean, why not let why not let supply be responsive to demand? Unleash that demand. Get net metering rules. Do something that empowers consumers. Talk about these things in terms of market principles, and you get them to lap it up. You talk about it in terms of, we're going to go ahead and say by 20 years from now, we're going to have X% in this. That's when you start to lose some of those people that you need to change the underlying climate to accomplish the objectives here. So I understand the lure of simply saying by the year 2040, we want to have 40% allocated to such and such energy sector. I think a more useful or successful way of doing that would be talking about it in the market terms that I'm talking about, and you'll find that you're able to do that. You're going to be able to accomplish all the things that we're talking about up here using that nomenclature.
So know your audience.
Know your audience.
Great. So we're about to move to Q&A, so I may fast forward, but this might be a chance, Ethel, to give a plug about the Sustainability Leadership Institute.
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, I just want to respond because I think that Senator Davis is right on. It's all about vernacular. I think we can get to the same common goals with, really utilizing the drive of, it's what's going on globally. When I went to COP26, I was kind of, at this climate change conference, I opened my mouth, I was from South Carolina, and everyone was like, why are you here? And I said, well, the Department of Commerce sent me here. And when you have financial institutions and you have the private sector and you have the shareholders, investors, and consumers driving this conversation, it becomes an economic development conversation. And I think that that's where we're poised and positioned and don't want to get sideways on that to really elevate the state in this way. So I'm in total agreement with that. The Sustainability Leadership Initiative. So that is a fellowship program that we have done in partnership with the Shai Institute for Sustainability and Communities. And I don't know if Courtney Quinn is here, but she's our program director and has really led that program from Furman. And we have 26 fellows. It's a class rubrics, which is a mix of industry, conservation NGOs, ag, forestry, state agencies that come together around really sustainability topics, but it's modeled after Liberty Fellowship, and that we really are trying to implement through that cross-sector population or pollination, moving the state forward and really bringing everyone up to speed on how South Carolina can transition.
Great.
So thank you for.
Seemed timely, seemed relevant.
Yeah, it's relevant.
Well, it's an all hands on deck, so the more folks we can change and bring into the conversation, the better.
We're getting ready to name our class publicly, but you might know some people that maybe representatives on this stage.
Well, that's exciting.
Or companies that are on this stage.
Very
so,
good.
Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. So I'll go ahead now and invite our students onto the stage that are going to lead the Q&A. While they come out, I want to put a plug in for next week. Last week I waited till the end and everybody rushed out right at 8 o'clock. So I might give our plug for week 3 right now while we wait for our students to come out with our questions. Kind of touching on what Senator Davis said about how to communicate with your audience. We're going to be joined on Zoom by renowned climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe, who is an expert on how we communicate and talk about climate change. She's also one of my personal climate heroes. We'll have then a panel with Furman Professor of Sustainability Science, Jeffrey Hebron, who is leading research on equitable climate resilience in the Carolinas. He'll be joined by Furman alumna Emily Wurzba, who works for the Environmental Defense Fund, and Dale Threat Taylor, head of the Nature Conservancy in South Carolina. Next week's program will end a little early at 7:45 so that we have time afterwards to mingle and chat with both Furman undergraduate and Ollie students about how we are all engaging in climate action. We ready? All right, let's go.
So the first question is for Phyllis Cuttino. So last week it was mentioned that some corporations are making pledges to be carbon neutral despite not being truthful to their promise or greenwashing. What are the best ways for us to find out which corporations are following this trend or making real change?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think I mentioned earlier that the U.S. Security and Exchange is going to be requiring that companies actually document their risks and are very clear about how they are going to address those risks. So that's one way. Another way is Moody's. So Moody's is a credit rating agency, and they are looking at all these corporations, what they're saying they will do and then what they are actually doing. So they're these kind of independent or government organizations that are watching. But also, what you need to do is you need to read the fine print. So there are a lot of organizations, advocacy organizations and others that watch these corporations, that document what they are doing or what they're not doing. There are lists that are published. If you email me, I'll send you a few of those companies that are doing well and other companies that are lagging behind. But you do have to do your homework. I talked earlier about kind of raising your climate IQ, and you need to pay attention and do some research.
Our next question is, we've gotten several questions about nuclear energy and the pros and cons. Can the panel comment on the diversity of energy mix and where you think we should evolve?
I'll take a stab at that because I talked a little bit about nuclear with the VC summer situation. But even since then, there have been exponential changes in regard to nuclear generation. I mean, portable, smaller, more efficient, more practical, more cost-effective. So I do think that nuclear plays an important role in getting to a carbon-neutral future. One of the sort of paradoxes is nuclear power isn't really welcome in the green community, right? It sort of has a rep from 3 Mile Island or back in the day, and the no nukes rock concerts and things of that nature. But really, if you're looking at the most efficient way to immediately cut down on greenhouse gases and to generate clean power, nuclear's got to be a part of that mix. And that's especially the case. I love wind. I love solar. But it only runs when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And I think a prudent state policy approach has got to mix in with those renewables something like nuclear power. So I do think, but that's where leadership comes in and education comes in, because people are disposed to think about nuclear power in a certain way right now. And we've got some work to do in that regard.
Can I just say, so we're extending the life of current nuclear power plants. When we're building new plants, like the one in South Carolina or like one in Georgia that is, I would say, grossly over budget and behind schedule, that's a challenge. And the public is nervous about nuclear power. You can see kind of the worry right now in the coverage about Ukraine and what's going to happen to that nuclear power plant, which is very unique. But there are big bets being made on nuclear power. So Bill Gates is a big proponent. He's pouring a lot of money into these small modular reactors. At the moment, organizations like the Navy, who love their nuclear, frankly, right? It powers them, their submarines all around the world. They haven't made that bet yet. So it'll be interesting to see if they do, because if they would, that would be a game changer in terms of small modular reactors. But at the moment, we're not quite there yet, but there's a lot of interest in that. But I just don't think we're going to build any big nuclear power plants in this country.
I think that ship sailed.
It's just not, it's not economically feasible.
So the next question is for Kasel Knight. What do you say to companies that may be afraid that long-term investments in climate-friendly technology will leave them vulnerable to their competitors in the short term?
Well, we've struggled with this because Milliken has 4 divisions, one of which is a textile division. And so although we do make some high-tech fabrics, some of the fabrics we make are also imported from low-cost labor countries with much cheaper manufacturing costs. So we're very competitive on cost in that industry, and we're very pushed to lower our internal costs so that we can keep whatever profit we're able to get on those products. And that's something that we, is how Milliken developed in the South and something we plan to continue doing, but it's also a difficult industry to be in. And so we struggled with that, and we've decided to see it as a competitive advantage, like I mentioned before, that there is going to be a demand for products that are made more sustainably and with investments having been made in more sustainable technologies and manufacturing methods. I will say that Milliken is a bit fortunate in that we are diversified. So we do have income from other businesses that comes into the corporation as a whole, and we can use perhaps a little bit to shore up some of the more challenging industries. But, we've already seen customers that we never thought would be interested in sustainability. That 5 years ago, if we mentioned that word, they would say, "Get out of here, I don't want to hear you talk about that. That's going to cut into my costs." Now they're asking for it, and it's happened so rapidly, it's astonishing. I feel like I'm watching it real time, but it's truly happening, and we feel like getting out there on the forefront is going to put us in a better position in the long term.
Maybe I could add, thank you. So maybe I can add too, I think the perspective of the balance between sustainable and good business, if I think about Proterra, we're not in the business of being the best electric bus company in the world. We're in the business of being the best bus company in the world. So some people view the sustainability portion as sometimes a hindrance. For us, the clear mission is be the absolute best and do the right thing from a sustainability side on the way there. But I think it's a transition that we're seeing based on the receptiveness of customers, based on the evolution of the supply chain, and I truly believe it's possible. It may be easier in some industries than others, but I truly believe you can, as someone said earlier, you can do well while doing good.
Great. And then I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interject. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. That's my primary job, is to end on time. So I want to pose a final question to every panelist, 30 seconds or less. What is one thing you'd like the people in this room to walk away with tonight, or to continue a conversation about when they leave? Maybe we can start with Ethel and move down the line.
Sure. I think I'm just going to repeat that South Carolina is truly poised and positioned to be a leader in this space. And I think that, we say that South Carolina is the future of commerce and conservation, that they're not mutually exclusive. So just continue these conversations. I love what the Riley Institute is doing, and really push forward in elevating the state. And we've been recognized nationally and globally, Sustain SC. going to speak at UNGA, going to speak at COP27 for our global to local model. And everybody out there sees the state ready to do this, and so I hope you all will join in being excited around that as well.
Thank you.
So,
I'm thinking about it. I'd speak to the students tonight. You're probably wondering, what's next and what you should do and what the expectations are for you. I would say find out what you have a passion about. When I was growing up, I always liked building things. But then tie that passion to something that makes the world better. So whatever your passion is, figure that out, something you enjoy, something you're good at, and apply it to a worthy cause, because frankly, everyone up here, we're counting on you. So it's really important.
Good message. Echoing what a lot of other people say, I just think that all of this from a business perspective has gained a lot of momentum, and it's not going to stop. And it's become real. It's shifted from theory and a good thing and we're good people to real, this is happening, economic imperative, this is essential for business going forward. So don't stop, don't give up. Speaking for my own business, we're looking for the solutions to make our net zero goals and our other sustainability goals happen. So go out there and help us find them, help provide them.
It's very hard in politics to change something that's been done a certain way for a long time, whether it's education or healthcare or taxes. And very rarely do you come across opportunities to fundamentally change things. Energy policy right now is one of those things. The silver lining of the 2017 failure at VC Summer was it forced us to examine how we go about generating power. It forced us to look at the moral hazards associated with the model we've had in place for 100 years. So that situation is very much in flux right now. It's pliable. You can affect changes. So if you make demands known in regard to clean renewable energy, you want those options, you want those alternatives, you want those choices, you're going to find policymakers, politicians, receptive to change, where ordinarily they would not be. So this is a sector, I think, where we move quickly. Now that window closes quickly, and we're very easily distracted by the next shiny object. But right now we're still paying attention to energy policy, so we got a window of time to do something right.
So I'm just going to be very simple, which is be a climate warrior, because all of us and our livelihoods and your future and the planet depend on it. And you can do right while doing good, and you can save the planet. And for those of you who are the students in the room, we're looking at all of you, because my generation, and I would argue, I'm older than some of these folks on the panel, but I would argue that we've kind of done the wrong things, and so we're looking at you to do the right things. So be a climate warrior.
Let's hear it for our panelists. Thank you, and I hope to see you all next week. Same place, same time.